Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to the speaker series talks today. And once again, thank you to the Royal Tyrrell Museum Cooperating Society for sponsoring this. And our work takes place through the province that is known as Alberta. We gratefully recognize and honor Indigenous peoples' long-standing connections to these lands. Our speaker today is Michael Caldwell, Albertan boy, who has done some of his degrees at the University of Alberta, did his PhD at McGill, and for the past over quarter century has been back at the University of Alberta as a professor in biological sciences. And most of Michael's work focuses on mosasaurs and the origin and evolution of snakes. But I'd also like to give a shout out for some of his early work on co-describing a new order of Paleozoic fish called fork-tailed thelodonts. And we have examples of some of those in our marine Paleozoic gallery. And there's some nice glass ones in the chandelier over the entrance to the Learning Center. So if you're interested in looking at those, very cool fish. So today Michael is going to talk about, not surprisingly, the paleontology and evolution of snakes. Michael.
Thank you, Jim. All right. It's my pleasure to be invited to speak to you all. I won't belabor the fact that this is the first time in 26 years I've had an invitation to come down to the Tyrrell and stand on this stage, but it is, as a result, kind of a double pleasure. I've always wondered what it would be like to be up here in front of the folk from the museum and the local community, and now I have the opportunity to enjoy that invitation. So thank you very much. When I was asked if I would consider coming down to give a lecture in the seminar series, I thought, well, you know, the obvious choice of topics would be what resulted in one of my recent PhD graduates. I thought, you know, I could follow what Ilaria does now and stick to the mosasaur theme, because I am very, very happy to note, not that I have a problem with the ruling archosaurs of the world, but I am happy to note that your collections are slowly but surely becoming dominated by marine reptiles as opposed to the long-standing and expected dinosaur material in collections. And I thought, well, I could do mosasaurs, but then, you know what they are. They're on your logos now. I see them in the advertising. Let me tackle something that's a little bit more out of the Alberta ordinary. And I will lead into the talk by saying I have to travel the world to work on fossil snakes, because what we find here in Alberta results in a handful of isolated vertebrae. Not a single jawbit that I'm aware of, unless one's hidden in the fish collections, having been mistakenly identified as a fish of some kind. We're really stuck with vertebrae. And I'll get into what we know about the evolution of snakes as a result of the fossil record shortly. And that's why I thought, well, I'll talk about that. And you'll see I'm also using as a graphic a book I published back in 2019 on the origin of snakes. And I thought, well, I'm at the Tyrrell Museum. Let me focus on what it is that we do from the paleontological side of the story when we're asking questions about the evolution and origin of snakes. If you've got an interest in plesiosaurs or ichthyosaurs, as Ilaria would know, there are no extant members of the group to muddy the water. The data set is completely the fossil record. But for a group like snakes, which we have almost 4,000 described species among 12,000 known species of squamates these days, we have an excellent modern fauna. And there is also a lot of effort, and I'll show you some of that, to try and understand the evolution of snakes from the modern fauna alone. I would suggest, and I'll humbly, maybe not so humbly submit, because we're here at a museum of paleontology, that we can't talk and understand anything about the origins of snakes in the absence of the fossil record. That in fact, we need the full data set of both fossils and the anatomy, molecules, et cetera, of extant groups in order to really tackle the question as specifically and as broadly as we need to if we're going to go all the way back to the origins of the group. So I've structured the talk around that idea. And what do we do as paleontologists? Now, again, I know everyone in this room has got some sort of personal experience with collecting stuff out in the field, but I shot this at a general public kind of level of introduction and education. And so I wanted to take a few minutes, talk about how we do it on the paleontological side of things. What is paleontology as a founding discipline in the study of evolution and origins? What do we do? This involves field work, this involves work in museums and on the lab bench if we're actually going to come all the way forward to a well-reasoned hypothesis using the complete data set. Now, the complete data set makes the problem complex, there's no question about that, because I have to juggle what I have from the fossil record with the genome level gene sequencing that we can deal with these days as well. So it's a little bit of a game to play, and it's far from simple. But we'll just start with the data mining side of it. The field work part, and I'm just going to quickly go through this. I've done field work around the planet. Jim indicated that I had done some work on thelodonts. My first published paper of all things was on some flies. Second published paper was on rostroconch mollusks. And my third published paper is where I got to the whole thelodont, early jawless vertebrate stuff. And my field work has taken me everywhere. This selfie down in the corner, I'll focus on that a little bit more here in a few seconds, but I'm in Patagonia in central Argentina at a place called Cerro Policia, which is the name of that bump you can see behind me. And this is a spectacular locality for producing 120 million year old snake fossils. But I've pretty much been everywhere in my hunt for snakes, mosasaurs, which really has been my obsession for the last 30 years, squamate evolution, broadly speaking, taking us to this spot here, which I'll use to kind of profile field work when we're out hunting for snakes. It's really not that much different than what Caleb does when he's hunting for dinosaurs, and very, very similar to what Jim does when he's out looking for other fossil herps, salamanders, frogs, etc. So I want to take you to Argentina very quickly. Of course, it's a planes, trains, and automobiles game, which is slightly different than what we do here in Alberta, where it's really just an automobile and then the Shanks pony to get you out into the Badlands. And you really do need heavy-duty field work equipment like 4x4s for this work because we are out in the middle of nowhere. This is something that's totally unfamiliar to at least Government of Alberta employees or University of Alberta, where our grad students are unionized. But when we have a problem in the field, like the road has been washed out, I thought, well, now we have to wait for the state to come around, fix the road. Heck no, the truck's empty. The grad students all jump out, grab spades and shovels, and promptly rebuild the road. That's field work. What is it in Boss Baby? You know, sick leave is for the weak and the unionized. Well, road repair is for the ununionized grad students in Argentina. Food's pretty exotic and spectacular when we're doing field work there, and this is very reminiscent of exactly what we do when we're here in the field in Alberta. But really, you are out in the middle of nowhere. It's all about camping and everything associated with it. Where we work in Argentina, it's full of absolutely wonderful wild things. These are burrowing parrots. They come by in flocks of 20 or 30, and they're loud and raucous. Rheas are running around all over the place. We see guanacos, so that whole cameloid group. Lots of these. Fortunately, not many of these. This one was the size of a dinner plate, but it just keeps things slightly exotic. And then the way that paleontology works anywhere, it applies the same way when we're in the field in Patagonia. You begin walking, and staring at the ground, and staring at the ground until you find something. And this something, you can kind of see it, that little something is what's of interest. This is a snake vertebra, as it should happen. And then you get down on the ground, you begin staring at it to decide, is it one vertebra or is there more going on here? There's a terrible field photograph of the same thing. Not everything's small. There's also some big dino stuff to kind of get in the way of the interesting snake material. Sometimes it's not on a bedding plane in which you can lie down, but one rather that you have to stare right at. This is a sphenodontian, Priasphenodon, right there to give you an idea of what the collecting looks like. And sphenodontians are relatives of the only surviving member, the tuatara in New Zealand. And then if the find is good, like everywhere else in the world, the hard work begins. If anybody is here from the RTMP's Occupational Health and Safety Unit, pay no attention to the absence of the same. In Argentina, yes, there are no safety glasses, no earphones, no head cover, and no heavy boots. If they're not wearing sandals while doing this, it's kind of an odd day in the field in Argentina. And then, of course, we can depend on the pack mules because they're not unionized to carry these things out of the field once we make the field jacket. You'll notice this one's green. That's not an artifact of the photograph. That was the only color of plaster we could find in Neocaine before we went out into the field. This year was even better because they didn't have plain old brown burlap when we were there in January. This time round, it's bright blue. So any photographs of field jackets from this last field season, you're going to see blue burlap of all things. But this is what it comes down to. There's nothing different about the process of collecting snake fossils. And the other thing when you're in the field, which is exactly the same expectation of RTMP scientists, you can't forget about the geology. This is going to be the tool you use, the tool of sedimentology and the tool of stratigraphy to try and understand something about the paleo environment. What were those environments of deposition in which these organisms were living, or at least dying? And in the case of this locale that we're working at near Cerro Policia, so right out in the middle of northern Patagonia, this is an ancient fossil erg, or sand sea. Imagine on a much smaller scale, North Africa and the Sahara, and all that moving sand, that's what this was as well. So we have not just sedimentology to work with, where these fossil snakes, tiny dinosaurs, birds, and the sphenodontians are coming from, as well as an amazing fauna of late Cretaceous mammals. We've also got trace fossils. These ancient dune systems are burrowed to pieces, is the only way to describe it. And here you can see a burrow system. When the weathered patina cracks off of the bedrock, you can actually see just how completely bioturbated these wind-deposited sands actually are. And when you get really good weathered surfaces, both the plant bioturbation but also the organismal bioturbation begins to show up very, very clearly. These are fascinating environments with paleo surfaces of all sorts, paleosols, heavily bioturbated, stabilized by organisms, plants, as well as animals. And when we find the beautiful articulated material that I'll show you here shortly, we find it on the bedding planes on the top of those paleo surfaces, where everything obviously must have dried out. Sand began moving again under the influence of air and wind action, and that's where we find the articulated organisms, on the slip faces of these dune systems, above the stabilized material. Anything has been bioturbated. If you find anything in there, it's just chewed to pieces as you would expect, having been torn apart taphonomically. This is just to give you an idea of what we think this paleo-erg probably looked like during both a sand movement phase, but also during a stabilization phase. So they were complex communities with these ancient snakes living in them. Again, that geology is data. We get the specimen out. The grad students have carried it back to the vehicles. We head back with the specimen to the lab, and there we have Dr. Paparella and Aaron LeBlanc, also a former student of mine, looking at some mosasaur material here at the Terrell Museum back about 6 years ago. But this is where that painstaking process of preparation is undertaken to actually reveal what we found in the field and turn it into this. So that specimen that I showed you that was just one isolated vertebra on the surface of the rock at that point in time turned into this. And I'll get to a little bit of a discussion about snake fossils in particular here in a moment. But one of the things that makes this locality in Patagonia so important, where Alberta has only produced 30, maybe 40 isolated snake vertebrae, very undiagnostic and uninformative of what the overall animal looked like. This locality, we have about 15 articulated specimens. We have skulls for most of those articulated specimens, and we have another dozen dissociated but articulated skulls from the locality. We have body sizes, we have ontogenetic information, and we have diversity. When the material was first collected, it was thought, oh, single taxon. No. There are at least 2, if not 3, distinct body types that we can assign comfortably to different genera. That paperwork is on its way out as we speak. And the articulation of this stuff is quite spectacular. And what's even more interesting is that these things have rear limbs still. They've lost the forelimbs, but they're still in possession of back legs. Just like what I'm going to show you, still retained at this point in time, but by a diversity of marine forms. So from this alone, we can learn that during snake evolution, they lost the forelimbs first. Different groups held on to the rear limbs, and independently, they all evolved this elongate limbless body form as the rear limbs were finally lost in different lineages of ancient groups of snakes. It's kind of a fascinating spot. We also have museums. I can go to a museum collection and data mine, which is exactly how it was done by Mike Lee and I way back in 1996 when we hit collections in Jerusalem, and I'll show you some of this material, and realized that something that had been characterized as a dolichosaur, a kind of basal or stem member of the lineage that includes mosasaurs, had been misidentified as a dolichosaur, was in fact a snake with rear limbs. This is Pachyrhachis problematicus. Data mining from museums is pretty incredible. So here we go. We've got everything from museums. We've got everything from the field. Today, we've got all kinds of fancy tech toys. I know that Ilari is this afternoon headed to the beam in Saskatoon in order to scan material. We can do it in a big stream of electrons there, or we can throw some gamma radiation at it in one of these boxes, and we come up with from a beautiful little snake skull like this one from Argentina, we can come up with this kind of data now that allows us to see not just the outside but the inside without disturbing the specimen in the least. No grinding them down to make thin sections to see what the cranial vault was all about and how the elements forming the brain case articulate with each other. Nope, we can do it digitally and powerfully, and it communicates information in a spectacular way, both in terms of internal structure, even down to almost the submicron level, depending on what you're working with in terms of a scanning system. We can look at histology, attachment of teeth histologically, or the way that bones are formed. So I have a very powerful tool now in vertebrate paleontology and paleontology in general, just from the field work and then the prep work and the museum systems that bring us to this point with a data set like this. Then we have the third place to go, which, for me as a squamate worker, is unique compared to what a number of my paleontological colleagues are able to do, and that's to work with the modern fauna and all of its diversity and the implications that this modern diversity has for questions we might have on the origins of snakes or the subsequent evolution of snakes coming forward from that 100-million-year-old material that I work with in Argentina, as an example, or the similar-aged material from the Middle East, from the West Bank and from Lebanon. So I've got quite a data set problem, if you want the honest truth. It's a little bit overwhelming, 4,000 some odd species, and I don't know, 10 billion individual nucleotides in all of these genomes from all of this diversity. Most of this stuff, everyone in this room is familiar with. You guys probably cannot help living in Drumheller be exposed to some garter snakes. And if I asked anybody, including my mom, and she's my usual example of general public, if I asked my mom what she thinks about a snake, she's going to give me a description of this sort of thing. I'm going to show you in a few seconds. These guys are the interesting ones, though. Almost no one knows what they are. There aren't very many of them when it comes to species diversity, and they're incredibly bizarre. If space aliens landed and stayed, this is probably who they are, especially in the world of snakes. But in any case, we bring all that stuff together. This is my lab group way back when. This is an only slightly younger Dr. Paparella off to the side here. Michelle Campbell, Aaron LeBlanc, Tiago Simoes, and Sydney Moore. This is my lab group from about 7-8 years ago. None of them are in the lab anymore. But in any case, we put all that together, and we do what everybody here at the Terrell Museum does as well. That complete data set is what we use to try and understand something about the evolution of snakes, broadly speaking, through time. So going way back into the at least Jurassic period, for part of the record, through to the top up here, which is essentially the crown, the modern group. Where did the modern group come from? Where did all that diversity come from? And what did they look like back here? That's the game, I guess, is the very best way to describe it. And we publish that stuff, and there's some reflection of fossil information and information from the living fauna, talking about venom fangs in this case, or about how snakes resorb their teeth, which is very unique and different as compared to a modern lizard. But unsurprisingly, we find some similarities in how they do that with mosasaurs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Blending the entire fossil record and the record of extant snakes together in order to say something intelligent about the evolution of the group. But as I said, a few years back, I wrote this book on the paleontological side of it all, morphology and the fossil record. What do we understand about the origins of snakes using that data set? The book was organized around these 7 chapters, so to speak, these 7 ideas. I'm not going to review the book for you here at all. If you ever encounter it, read chapter 4 and forget about the rest. Chapter 3 is 120 pages of comparative anatomy, and even I go to sleep when I go back to read the thing. So don't do that to yourselves. But chapter 4 is pretty fun, and maybe 6 talking about the various arguments about phylogeny. But what I want to do for the rest of the talk is really introduce you to, let's call it the philosophical problem, the metaphysical question. What is a snake? What is it we're hunting for? What answers are we trying to come up with? And what are the boundaries of our data set? Because if I ask my mom, is a chicken a snake? She's going to say no, of course, which means chickens are now excluded from the analysis. Because I'll listen to my mom right through to the end of my life, of course. I'll stick with what mom is going to tell me are the boundaries of my data set. And this is not a trivial question, because we can ask this of a lot of people, and I've had some spectacular answers to what is a snake. Sometimes with a question back, well, are worms snakes? And I realize, wow, I'm stepping forward here into some new territory to explain the possession of, let's just say, an endoskeleton. And you have to take that question seriously, because this is also going to affect your data set. So no, worms are not snakes. Eels are not snakes. Long, skinny things are not snakes. And this is consequential because we, in the world of vertebrate evolution, consider snakes to have been derived from a 4-legged ancestor that would itself have been a kind of early snake. So even speaking to people to firm up the boundaries of that category, that snakes are extremely derived tetrapods that lost their limbs, is part of this what is a snake question. Okay? And it's not trivial, because it's also going to affect, as field scientists, our search image. If you find something in the Jurassic with 4 limbs, and you decide, well, it hasn't lost its legs, it's not long and skinny, it can't be a snake, you could very well be wrong. Because what you need to understand first is what it is that defines snakeness. Is it being long and skinny and legless, or is it something else? Is it something about the head? And so this is hardly a trivial question, because it was something as a 4-legged organism before it took on what we think of when we look at that image with 4,000 different species of snakes and think, snake, I got it. It looks like a garter snake. Well, the ancestral snake didn't look like a garter snake. It looked like a 4-legged lizard, and it didn't have a long body, and it probably had a long neck, but even before it had a long neck, it probably had a short neck like all the other lizards out there, right? This is really important because we're trying to get that out of this. And somehow there need to be some features that will connect this to that. Because being long and skinny isn't it. It's this kind of a story that we hunt for when we're talking about the origins and evolution of a group that underwent such a profound morphological transformation. Or is it profound? Let me show you what I think happened. So it's easy to draw your own tree and go, this is what Mike believes are the sister group relationships of snakes relative to all the other known squamates or lizards out there. And if I was to highlight it, the snakes are inside that box, which means snakes are nested quite comfortably within this whole radiation of both the modern fauna and through time for about the last 180 million years of everything we think of as lizards, okay? Goes by the formal name, the Squamata, which means snakes are lizards, which means, again, as I was just saying, we're coming back to the fossil record and to our origins and evolution question to ask a question about a group that we know has 4 legs for the most part. They're tetrapods, nice, clear tetrapods. Any green iguana owners in the room or somebody with a gecko at home, you know what I'm talking about. 4-legged, tetrapodal, squamate reptile, okay? Snakes are lizards, which means our ancestry question and our morphology hunting eyes, when we're looking at the fossil record, we need to be looking for something else beyond just skinny and legless, okay? Serpentes and this wide variety of other organisms in which we see, and the reason I've highlighted these, amphisbaenians, with this one exception, 200 living species, they're all completely legless. We see legless members of the skink crew, Anelitropsis, and dibamids over here. We have legless forms of geckos alive today. If anyone has ever seen a legless skink, there are literally hundreds of species of skinks alive today that are limbless. Limblessness pops up here amongst the anguid lizards, lots and lots of living forms of anguids that have no limbs. So being long and skinny and limbless isn't just restricted to this group of lizards, the Serpentes. It's broadly distributed across the entire clade. And that's just the living fauna. What snakes are unique about, compared to all these other forms except the amphisbaenians, what makes snakes unique is that we don't actually have anymore a legged version of a snake. Whereas we have legged geckos, we have limbed skinks, we have limbed, teids, we've got all kinds of other examples of limbed members of these groups, including the limbless forms. So this limbless thing is broadly distributed in the whole clade. So I highlighted in the book a couple of problems, and this is one of them. How do we discover what is primitive? And this is not a trivial question. Can we go to the modern fauna of snakes and find primitive in the sense that will help us have insight on what the most ancestral or stem form of Serpentes actually was? Or are all the living forms of snakes simply derived members of the group that reflect only in the broadest terms features that would have been present in the most distant, ancient, ancestral, or stem members of the clade. What does primitive mean? And this has been a battle in the literature for a very long time, trying to determine whether or not ancestral states are present in the modern fauna, or if they can be found here in the fossil record. If we look at the modern group, so 4,000 some odd described species, these are pretty derived relative to that, and this is what everybody thinks of as snakes. No limbs to speak of in 99% of the modern snake radiation, though we get a little bit of a pelvic girdle and a spur, a remnant of the femur, in things like pythons and boas. They used them during mating in order to hold on, I guess is the best way, most polite way to describe that. So they're overemphasized in the males. And then there's this group, the scolophidians, the blind burrowing snakes. For the first part of the 20th century and the later part of the 19th century, the fossil record was considered key, and the fossil record of snakes was terrible, boiled down to a couple of vertebrae and one skull in 1901 from South America, a thing called Denalicia patagonica. But still, the fossil record was considered key in informing us on the origins of snakes. We hit the 1920s, 1930s, the fossil record is abandoned in conversations on the origins and evolution of snakes, and instead, these guys end up at the center point of this conversation. And it is decided, it's what I call the scolophidian problem, it is decided that these little blind burrowing snakes represent, if in fact they are not actually, the ancestral kind of snakes. And this is in a book written by a fellow by the last name of Walls, 1940. And Walls was looking at the organization and structure of the retina in the eyeball and the structure of the eyes overall. And he concluded that the living species of Typhlops, a kind of scolophidian, must have spent some phase where it was blind, burrowing, and blinking on the surface, and I'm quoting him here. I don't know how one survives as a reproducing population of anything blind, blinking, and burrowing on the surface, but whatever. He decided Typhlops represented the primitive snake, if not was the ancestral snake itself. And that idea took hold. The fossil record was ignored. Scolophidians become primitive snakes. This is what they look like. They spend their lives hiding in ant hills and termite burrows, chasing down ant larvae and sometimes adult ants. They're super tiny. This apparently is terrifying if you're a termite. This is full mouth on attack by a scolophidian. And if we take a look at their skulls, they're equally as bizarre in terms of their cranial morphology as anything could possibly be within what we understand snake skulls to be built like. When I said they look like space aliens, I'm not kidding. A typical boa skull looks a little bit lizardy still. There are lots of squamate features in place. These things are so remarkably different that they actually only really compare well anatomically to the most derived groups of snakes. So to vipers, for instance, that like this little guy have a mobile maxilla that's pushed forward by the vomeropalatine complex in order to stab a termite larvae while feeding. Very, very unique and highly derived animals. And here you can see what I mean. This is a leptotyphlopid on the top, a lanthanotine or varanoid lizard down on the bottom, progressing our way up to series of snakes, which still look more like this than anything does like that. But yet, in the modern herp world, this became the ancestral snake morphology. Okay? And we really got stuck there for a long time. I always use this example when I'm trying to take shots at scolophidians as primitive snakes, because if you were a mammologist and I was standing on the stage trying to convince you that the ancestral morphotype for all ground squirrels, all tree climbing squirrels, et cetera, these guys, that this was the primitive form rather than being the most derived member of that clade, and this is the burrowing naked mole rat, by the way, you'd be laughed out of a mammologist systematist conference. But somehow this burrowing snake thing took hold, and it has been a heck of a job to actually work past it. Way back in 1997, this is what Mike Lee and I actually said, is that this isn't the most primitive snake morphology at all, but rather the fossil record will increasingly start to show us that we have ancestral snakes that show anatomies much more similar to these, and that these guys are probably highly nested up in here somewhere. This was heresy in 1997, and still a little bit heretical today, but you're looking at the chief heretic. People are used to me talking about this now, and so it invokes less violence in my colleagues than it used to. But in any case, so let's go to the fossil snakes. So let me show you a little bit about the fossil record. I talked about these marine snakes with limbs that come from the Middle East, broadly speaking. We now have a great diversity of forms. The fossil material is quite amazing. It's beautifully preserved and articulated. This is Eupodophus descoensis from Lebanon. You can see the rear limb back here. Very, very tiny, but it's still there with a partial pelvic girdle. This is Pachyrhacus problematicus. The type specimen is over here with this beautiful head, not well enough preserved to see the limbs, but on the paratype specimen, there's a beautiful leg right in there. And here's a tiny baby version, again, a tiny rear limb. Lovely material, and what we see is not just similarity in form of these marine snakes, but diversity. There are at least 3 genera, if not 5, represented by just what's here on the screen, which means these would have been breeding populations. There would have been millions of individuals over time, hundreds of millions over 5 million years worth of time. They would have been everywhere, and they show a variety of skull morphologies, a variety of pelvic morphologies, limb morphologies, which tells us limbs were being lost, broadly speaking, across the entire group. From Argentina, no legs on this one that we've been able to ascertain yet. This is from younger rocks, Santonian Campanian. This is Deinonychia patagonica. But again, coming from an ancient sand sea, the same as Nahash rionegrina, which is the one I've been collecting now for years in central Patagonia, just south of the Deinonychia localities. And here you can see, this is a really robust rear limb. This is the femur. The pelvic girdle is in 3 pieces here, and descending below the femur is the tibia. At least a couple of toes in this animal, but nothing from the fossil record with 4 limbs. We have to go back into the Jurassic, and we don't have anything complete, but we have to go back into the lowermost part of the Cretaceous and the uppermost part of the Jurassic in order to identify snakes from cranial remains. And this brings us to the body problem. So I've already talked about this in earlier parts of the presentation, but what came first? The snake head or the snake body? If we ask this question, and it's terribly relevant, some people would suggest that a non-snake kind of lizard, and this would be Nick Longrich and his co-authors from about 2012, that a non-snake lizard evolved a snake-like body. We already know that lots and lots of different groups of modern forms of lizards have got snake-like bodies. That's no innovation whatsoever. And yet the thing that connects them to their legged forms is their skull. So it would in fact seem that it's the other way around, that snakeness is an adaptation of the feeding system, that thing that organisms use head forward, face forward, to make their way in the world and to obtain energy in order to sustain their bodies. The snake limbless thing could then evolve later on. If snake features, and certainly not a crotalid, they weren't all rattlesnakes 180 million years ago, that's new. But I put that on there as kind of a graphic representation of what we think of as a snake. And that's consistent with what we see among living groups of lizards, where we know what a limbed anguid looks like. And we know that skink. And we know that that's a legless skink. There's a genus in Australia, the genus Larista, about 130, 140 described species, and they show every version of limblessness from complete limb loss to one toe on the front leg, two toes on the back leg, no front limbs, three toes on the back leg, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Limb loss and becoming long and skinny is easy, but yet you know it's a skink because it has a skink skull. I can give you those heads and you'll go skink. And then I can ask you, is that a legless one or is that the legged one? And unless you're a skink expert, you won't be able to tell me. Because this is the part, whether you're a gecko, whether you're a gymnophthalmid, or whether you're an anguid, that shows the features of the group, not that long body. And yes, there are a few things that make you an anguid, even in the postcranium, legged or not, but I think you kind of get the point. And so the question is, elongate and limbless first, or is it all about the head? And I think it's all about the head, which is why we can go to the fossil record and go back into the Jurassic and maybe even older rocks and start to understand something about the origins and evolution of snakes, because it's the skull that's going to give us the insight on when you've hit that stage of cranial evolution that will make you a snake. Not a modern snake, but a 170 million year old snake. Snakes are lizards. That's the search image. Conclusions: lizards are snakes. And I know that seems obvious, but I can go to a herp conference and I can submit a talk on snakes and I don't end up in the symposia on lizards. I end up in a snake symposium. And if you hear people talk about it, you'll often hear Squamata is composed of lizards, snakes, and amphisbaenians. For heaven's sakes, amphisbaenians and snakes are lizards too. Let's help the research program by using proper language when we talk about the group. They're an excellent vertebrate group for studying patterns and processes of evolution, both deep and recent, because we have such a huge extant fauna and because we have a great fossil record. And that fossil record doesn't match the diversity of the living fauna at all. I wouldn't even attempt to argue that. But what the fossil record does is it gives us insights on morphological disparity that doesn't exist anymore in the extant fauna, because we've been talking about an astonishing 200 million years of evolution, give or take a little bit. Why would we see that morphological disparity amongst the living diversity? We wouldn't. The fossil record tells us what this looked like a very long time ago and gives us insight in a way that the modern fauna can't. It is mute to that change. We have to go to the rock record. The questions are endless, and I always like to end talks like this on one of my favorite quotes, which is, each answer only rattles the questions harder. So for every single one of the opportunities I've had to provide a hypothesis on a nagging problem, I have revealed 1,000 more new questions. That's one of the great things about science. It's my pleasure to have been able to stand up here and talk with you about what I do. Thank you for the invitation.
Are there any snake fossils that show direct evidence that any of the species we know of could have been venomous?
So unless it's changed, and Alfred might be able to answer this, but I think the youngest record we have of venom-capable fangs comes from the Miocene of Western Europe. I don't think there's anything older than that still. So that takes us back, I'm not sure what age. The Miocene is a long period of time. I think it's about 20 million for the earliest evidence of fangs that would have been capable of envenomation. It doesn't mean that venom gland systems wouldn't have been present, that didn't have necessarily, the old venom groove or a tube in the way that we see them produced in modern venomous snake groups. And that one paper I showed you where we were working on the origins of the venom structures in fangs, 20 million years is about the oldest we have from the rock record. So that means that most of the evolutionary history of snakes, they just bit. Coiled, maybe. No venoms. How does Coniophis precedens fit in with the new material from Argentina? For those of you that don't know, I alluded very quickly to Coniophis. That's the genus and the species precedens that we've assigned the vertebrae from Alberta to. I'm forgetting the species that Jim described, Coniophis, or did you leave it open nomenclature? Left it open. The type material of Coniophis precedens was described by Marsh in 1880. That's not quite right. Anyways, 1880 or 1884. But in any case, how does that fit in with the material from Argentina? The problem with all of the Coniophis material is it's only known from isolated vertebrae or a couple of vertebral units, of which there are maybe 2 or 3 that are still in articulation. And the genus, broadly speaking, runs through from the late Albian all the way through, I think, to the Oligocene, which means it's a form taxon. I can't tell you, despite the publication from 2012 by Longrich et al., I can't tell you what the cranial elements look like in the animal because nothing's ever been found. There are a couple of snake jaw bits from a couple of localities. Berkeley has one, the American Museum has another. Longrich et al. Assigned those jaw bits to the vertebral form taxon of Coniophis precedens. That's disputed, if not broadly ignored. But that means that I can't say much about how Coniophis fits in with the Argentinian material. It's also very small and looks more like, which is why it's been compared to, the living groups of anilioids, Cylindrophis and Anilius. But again, it's very, very few vertebrae with very, very few distinguishing features other than a couple of key anatomical features that link it to snakes. It's about the best way to describe it. So I wouldn't compare Coniophis with the Argentinian material. Have you ever seen any trace fossils of snakes or snake burrows? No, I haven't, and this is from Joan. I haven't, but I know Steve, his last name, Hasiotis. Stephen Hasiotis, who is an ichnologist and trace fossil worker, Hasiotis has described what he thinks are snake-like burrow structures from, I believe, Upper Jurassic rocks in Utah. Other than that, I'm not aware of anything that has been described on the ichnofauna side to snake burrowing activity. That would be the closest thing. And I think along with those burrows, there are also some surface traces that look a little bit like what sidewinders do, modern group of crotalids from here in North America, the way that sidewinders and some viperids move when they're moving across unstable sand surfaces. I think Hasiotis has described some of that as well. Elizabeth, what is the longest snake fossil that we found? Is sizing of prehistoric snakes the same as we see today for similar or same species? So the largest material is, of course, the vertebral elements of Titanoboa. Titanoboa is Paleocene from Colombia. The vertebrae are gigantic. It's the very best way to describe it. What we don't know, Elizabeth, is exactly how many vertebrae were in the body of Titanoboa. A modern anaconda runs at around 20 feet. On a good day, some of the big ones that I'm aware of are up around 25, 26 feet, sort of the 7 meters, 8 meters in length. Same with some of the big Python reticulatus from Southeast Asia. If Titanoboa had a similar number of vertebrae to one of those modern anaconda, so boid, pythonid snakes, then it was truly gigantic. A big anaconda vertebra is about like so in diameter, just looking at it end on, and the titanoboa material is like this. There's a lot of compression of that titanoboa vertebral material, but they were big snakes. They were definitely aquatic snakes, I'll say that for them. I disagree ever so slightly with Jason Head's interpretation of how round they were, having seen the material myself, along with Dr. Paparella, but a very, very big snake.
When you were, if I understood you correctly, the main benchmark for the evolution of snakes is in the head, and I think you said that's reflected in, it has to do with feeding strategies. So is that the flexion point where they do their famous unhinge their jaw and swallow their prey whole, or is it
So no.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's not. What the snake skull is really good at, even going back, say, to the Nahash material from northern Patagonia, what it's really good at is just overall, shall we say, kinesis and flexibility in the skull. There's a vast literature on snake macrostomy. So in other words, the ability to eat things that are ridiculously large compared to your head. And it's absolutely true that something like a boa, an anaconda, for example, can eat a goat. It takes a long time to get the goat down, but the real technology involved in this, and anacondas, the boines and the pythonines among all snakes are much, much better at this than, say, rattlesnakes and cobras and that sort of thing. The technology involved is as much soft tissue in the larynx and throat region, the buccal region and the pharynx, as it is anything else. I said larynx, I take that back. The pharynx. You find an unusual plasticity and elasticity in even the collagen molecules that make up that part of the head around the back of the mouth and the throat. Because all you have to do in order to swallow a goat is simply be able to pop your lower jaws apart, which they can do. There's a little ligamentous band that holds the two tips of the mandibles together, and then get them out of the way. But getting them out of the way still isn't the problem. You got to get it down this. And that's one of the things that boines and pythonines do better than any of the other extant snakes. So even what we think of as a general snake feature of being able to eat large things isn't as true as we think it is. Full-on macrostomy is really only present in a collection of snakes that we don't put at the top of the snake family tree, which is the boines and the pythonines. And that doesn't mean that a rattlesnake can't eat itself a large rat. Of course it can. But it's nothing as extreme as what you see in kind of the middle part of the tree. Those scolicophidians, they're not macrostomes, but a termite larva, when your head's the same size as the termite larva, it's still doing what most snakes do, which is exhibiting a form of macrostomy. But there are specializations that they have in order to eat big things that you don't see in any of the other snakes except for some derived vipers. If we go back to the fossil record, it looks like they had big mouths. A varanid, a modern Komodo dragon, I've seen video footage of these things swallowing the whole leg of a goat that they've just torn to pieces. That's still a form of macrostomy. Most lizards do that. They feed, they're gravity feeders. They get a hold of, unless of course you're an iguana and then you sneak up on an apple. But most of the rest of them are gravity feeders, and anything they can get back there, they'll toss back. And again, that depends on the elasticity here, not so much on how big the gape can go.
So does their dentition in the fossil record give a sense of a change in diet or feeding strategy?
The dentition is pretty, shall we say, primitive for the entire group. Going as far back as we can with the late Jurassic forms, they still show some of that recurvature to the crown, to the tip of the tooth that we see in a modern boa. But then there are different groups of snakes that have got almost vertical teeth. They don't show that same recurvature. So dentition appears to be pretty conservative. All you really want to do with your teeth is just make sure that what you're swallowing can't get back out. So if it points in, you're good to go. And if you hold on to that morphology and that strategy of feeding, then again, you're good to go.
What's the thinking these days on an aquatic versus terrestrial origin for snakes?
So one of the things that I tackled in my book, which is another one of the chapters you don't need to read if you ever bother to pick the thing up, was to dispel the myths that had been built up in the literature over the last 30 years regarding all of this, because I had been accused by those who wished to throw stones. I had been accused of being a proponent of the aquatic origins hypothesis, and it's absolutely not true. Never wrote that down in a single paper or a single thing I've ever published. But what people say about you is entirely different than what you might have said, and can become a truth all unto itself. So, and as I said, I talked about that in the book. The origins hypotheses are, quite frankly, a bit of a waste of time because what we really need are good, solid, well-founded phylogenetic trees that are based on our best interpretations of anatomy. And even when we get those phylogenetic trees, what we're going to have are sistergroup hypotheses, not evolution and descendant and ancestor statements. If you're going to try and go back and, talk about the origins of a group and get very specific about it, if we go back, and this is what I have written for the last 30 years, if we go back to those phylogenies, if we go back to the fossil record, if we deal honestly with the fact that snakes are a kind of lizard, and if almost all lizards with 5 little toes and claws on the ends are terrestrial, then I would say today from this stage what I've said in print for decades, which is snakes are descended from a terrestrial ancestor. End of story. Now, what the ecologies were of the various lineages that are making their way to becoming the kinds of snakes we see today, that's a different question. But going back at that point in time where snakeness is starting to evolve as a feature of cranial specializations, this is going to take us to a 4-legged ancestor stage. That if it's like all the other squamates, which it should be because it probably is sourced from that point in time where lizards differentiate from all the other non-lizard small-bodied things in the late Triassic, then it's going to be a terrestrial origins story. And it's far less interesting than a burrowing one or an aquatic one. But nevertheless, that's probably how the story begins. Once we've got snakeness, man, these things went off and they did all kinds of things. I can point to at least a half dozen aquatic radiation events from a variety of snake lineages that went off to specialize, like modern elapids, the modern sea snakes and sea kraits. This is new. This is probably within the last 5 to 10 million years of elapid evolution that we see snakes invade marine environments again. But they did it repeatedly. Even that fauna from the Cenomanian of the Middle East makes it very clear that there was a radiation of snakes into aquatic environments at the same time as they are occupying sand sea environments in Argentina, and probably similar sorts of environments in northwest India, in the Deccan Plateau. It was a chaotic and multi-layered radiation of these animals repeatedly, terrestrial environments, marine environments, terrestrial environments, marine environments, over the last 180 million.
As a technician here at the museum, I've spent a lot of time in the field walking and walking and walking, and on my belly looking and looking and looking. in Alberta, I've never seen a single snake vertebra. And they have a lot of vertebrae in their bodies, so you would expect them to be kind of all over the place, but they're just not here. So my question is, were they just not here? Or is it a taphonomic bias, or what?
Wow. Let's go with they were here. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. There are bits and pieces. There are patchy remains, isolated jaw elements. There are a couple of things that I have no doubt are snakish that come from Montana, the Hell Creek Formation, a couple of spots like that. But again, there's no articulated material. And this is frustrating. I appreciate your 50 years of zealous hunting because we're not going to find it without that. The question is why? And part of me, there should be a marine record because there were snakes in the marine in other parts of the world at this point in time. We've got those fossils. We know they were there. So thinking of Alberta, Campanian to Maastrichtian, or even going as far back as the Albion-Aptian, Cenomanian, we should be finding them. I don't know why we're not. The Coniophis material, the frustratingly few vertebrae that we have from the province, they're all incredibly tiny. And if I compare them to the vertebral elements of similar extant snakes, Cylindrophis and Anilius are the two that are the most easy comparisons. I would almost be willing to hedge a bet that we're looking at juvenile forms, that these are not the adults of the species to which they belong. I've seen some very similar sorts of features in embryonic Anilius and Cylindrophis. So this is intriguing to me. Why we're not finding adults, I don't know. Or why we're not finding at least a remnant of an articulated individual, I don't know. Because we do find some pretty good stuff in the dinosaur park formation for other groups of organisms. And I don't know why the snake material is not there. Because there's absolutely no biological reason that I can understand as to why they wouldn't be present in the environments. Unless, of course, they're living in upland environments at the time. Now, there's a lot of rock time that we're talking about, 15, 16, almost 20 million years, but maybe they weren't in those environments where they were being fossilized. Maybe. I'm guessing. And thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was fun and interesting. That was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.